Thank you for viewing this introductory webinar on positive discipline. Have you ever wondered where your values came from? Have you wondered where empathy comes from? Have you ever wondered where self-control comes from? I often ask my university classes this question. It's a difficult question. The answer is not really very obvious, but the answer to all three questions is the same: discipline encounters. Discipline is one of the most powerful sources of values, empathy, self-control when it's done effectively. This webinar focuses on the science of effective discipline. We focus on discipline in the classroom, but the same principles apply to parenting. The goals for this webinar include that you'll learn basic principles of an effective form of discipline called induction. You'll map how induction leads to increased prosocial behaviors. You'll apply concepts to real-world scenarios, and you'll discuss the types of discipline to avoid. You'll discuss persistent persuasion. Discipline is common. It typically occurs multiple times in every class period. Almost half of teachers say that discipline episodes interfere with their ability to teach content. For that reason alone, it's important to discuss how to discipline effectively. But even more importantly, discipline is the vehicle through which we teach students values, empathy for others, and self-control. It's also a primary vehicle for helping students become more prosocial. Yet most teachers struggle with this important topic, so I invite you to listen to this webinar with an open heart and an open mind, to reflect on how you might improve your discipline approach, because we all have room for improvement. Professionals seek to grow, and because it is also so vital in helping your students flourish. Some of you are already disciplining in ways that promote self-control and prosocial behavior, and you'll learn the research base that supports or justifies what you're doing. There are many definitions of discipline. For our purposes, we will define it as any attempt to change students' misbehavior. What is your goal when you discipline students? Is it to punish them? Is it to stop the misbehavior in the here and now, or over the long term? Is it to help them become more self-governing over time or develop greater self-control? If your purpose is to punish misbehavior, this webinar is not for you. But if your goal for discipline is to teach students to govern themselves and become more prosocial, then this webinar is for you. What we call effective discipline is not just to get compliance in the here and now, but to educate the child about what is and is not appropriate behavior, and to promote self-control, so that they grow into the kinds of adults that you would like to work with and live next to. Think about discipline as a teaching opportunity. During discipline encounters, you are teaching students what behavior is acceptable to use in similar situations. So what form of discipline results in self-control and prosocial behavior? An approach that scientists call induction. What exactly is induction? Induction is a term for reasoning with a student during discipline. It's a type of discipline where you give the student a reason for obeying the rule or stopping the misbehavior. It is using the because clause, whether that's explicit or implicit. It comes from logic or philosophy, which means drawing general principles from specific instances. So two kinds of examples are here. Both teach a general principle and draw the child's attention to how their behavior affected another person. So one example is, Eli, we do not push in line. How would you like it if John had pushed you? Show John what a good class friend you can be. Another example is, we don't use names like that in this class. No one has the right to diminish the dignity of another human being. So one of the most robust findings in developmental research is that discipline is more effective when it is accompanied by a compelling justification or reason. Giving students a reason for asking them to change their behavior gives them information and what your values are, so they can begin to share in those values. It also makes the directive more legitimate. We're all more likely to comply with rules we see a good reason for. Like, think about your own experience. Maybe the district has issued a new rule and you don't see a point in it, so you are less likely to comply with it. But if the reason for it is explained to you, you're more likely to obey. Induction also feels less punitive. There's less to push back against, and this is a common reaction from your less compliant students. So how does induction lead to prosocial behavior? It leads students to internalize your values. It promotes self-control rather than other control in students. As a result, students disciplined with induction are more likely to obey rules even when no authority figure is standing over them. It gives students information they need to guide future behavior in similar situations. Even if directed at a particular student, every student within earshot will gain the same information. When you bother to give students a reason for complying with a rule, you're communicating that you care about and respect them. This motivates them to follow the norms and the values of your classroom community and to want to please you. It builds relationships, whereas punitive forms of discipline undermines relationships. You shape students' moral identity by communicating belief in their best selves. You can communicate that you assume the best possible motive rather than the worst possible motive. I'd like to pause for a moment on a particularly important type of discipline: victim-centered induction. As the name implies, this is where you focus the attention of the misbehaving student on his or her victim. This is one of the most powerful ways that you promote empathy in students. It's a way of teaching them to value others' well-being. During victim-centered induction, you follow these steps. You point out how the student's misbehavior affects others. You ask the student to imagine being in the other's place. And you suggest concrete acts of reparation when appropriate. This doesn't take lengthy talking it out episodes. This is not a therapy session. Just a couple of short, to-the-point statements are sufficient. Not all discipline encounters involve victims, so this approach is not always appropriate. But the more you use it, the more empathic your students will become toward each other. Here's an example of a teacher using victim-centered induction. Nolan, please turn off your game. It can be very distracting for the students who are sitting behind you and can see your computer. How would you feel if you were trying to pay attention but someone else was distracting you? Let's not make it harder for our classmates to pay attention. Notice that Mrs. Stein is focusing Nolan's attention on how his actions impact his classmates and asks how he might feel in this situation. She's not giving any indication that she suspects negative intention from Nolan's distraction. She's not shaming him. She focuses on giving compelling justification for Nolan to change his behavior and gives him a standard for appropriate future behavior. There are also types of discipline that you should avoid. For example, it's important to avoid psychological control. This is a type of discipline that conveys expressing disapproval, withdrawing affection, ignoring a student, stating that a student is bad, or even guilt-inducing. Disapproval is minimal in induction, but it's the very heart of psychological control. This type of discipline is sometimes called conditional regard. It's also called love withdrawal, because teachers can be warm to students, but only when they comply with what the teacher wants. To illustrate what psychological control might look like in the classroom, here are some examples. I'm ignoring you until you start behaving better. Calvin, are you causing problems again? I don't have any more groups I can put you with. Derek, go sit in the back. I'm tired of dealing with you today. Sending a student out of the classroom or excluding them from participating in a group are other forms of psychological control. Yet this approach is very common. It does have benefits, but also serious drawbacks. It might be successful in getting students to comply in the moment, but it comes at the risk of lower self-esteem, peer rejection as you undermine classmates' perceptions of a student, greater depression and anxiety, and lower performance in school as their emotions of shame and rejection swamp their ability to pay attention to the lesson. For example, in this study, researchers examined the effects of first grade teachers using psychological control strategies to discipline their first grade classrooms. In these classrooms, like in all classes, there were times when students were off task or expressing negative emotions. When teachers use discipline strategies that involve psychological control in response to their students' off-task behavior or negative emotions, students showed lower math skills at the end of the school year, and this was especially true among girls. Another type of discipline to avoid is power assertion. Power assertion is a type of discipline in which the adult, you, the teacher, relies on power, size, or resources to control the child. Often, power assertion involves taking away privileges. You might recognize it by an implicit or explicit or else clause. This is the single most common approach in schools. For instance, a harsh interpretation of this type of discipline are zero-tolerance policies, in which students are threatened with suspensions, expulsions, or referrals to law enforcement, even after only one offense. These punishments might be appropriate for severe behavior that harms the safety of other students, but increasingly these policies are applied for minor misbehaviors so that it contributes to what is known as the discipline gap. That is, that impoverished students, males, and ethnic minority students are disproportionately disciplined with power assertion. An example of power assertion might look like this conversation between a teacher and student. Jordan, this is the 5th time you're late for this class. You're getting a demerit. I'm sorry, I don't want to hear any excuses. I expect good students in my class to show up on time. Seriously, I hate school. Schools that emphasize power assertion tend to have lower achievement, poor school climate, and more dropouts. Suspensions and expulsions are particularly problematic because they remove students from learning time and can make students feel like they are not a valued member of the school community. There are other costs to using power assertion. These include that students learn it is acceptable for people in positions of power to threaten or coerce others and lash out when they're frustrated. Students also become resentful towards you, the disciplinarian. This can cause anger in students, it can increase defiance, and diminish the possibility of their cooperation. But most importantly, it undermines students' development of self-control. Students are not internalizing your values, so they are likely to become less compliant over time. A key point is that if you exert enough pressure, you can get kids to comply in the short term, but you undermine their long-term development of self-control. So in summary, there's 3 types of discipline. One is effective for promoting empathy, getting students to adopt your classroom values, norms, and helping them increase in self-control and pro-social behavior. The other 2 types of discipline, which are psychological control and power assertion, or exerting power over students by virtue of resources that you control and they do not, those 2 types of discipline interfere with learning. They can damage your relationship with students, and they can damage students' development of self-control and pro-social behavior. A common question among educators is, how do bribes, rewards, and punishments fit with discipline? To answer this, let's talk a little bit about operant conditioning. Many schools control student behavior through operant conditioning, which is controlling behavior through a program of rewards and punishments, sometimes called consequences. There are challenges in implementing operant conditioning on a school-wide basis or in regular education classrooms. Common mistakes include not reinforcing behavior that should be reinforced, or reinforcing the wrong behavior, or thinking something is reinforcing or punishing when it actually is not, and being inconsistent. This is usually only a problem in the beginning, in that intermittent reinforcement is actually beneficial in the long run once a behavior is stabilized. Also, operant conditioning takes a lot of teacher mental energy, making it hard to be equitable. Kids have radar for inequity, which can cause resentments. Operant conditioning also easily becomes power assertive discipline. When operant conditioning is implemented as power assertive discipline, it has the same costs that power assertive discipline does. And this is true even for seemingly mild and widely endorsed forms of punishment, such as timeout. Timeout is a common tool, but timeout does not actually teach students appropriate behavior. A good rule of thumb for understanding whether a discipline encounter was effective is to ask yourself, what did the student learn? Ask that question the next time you use power assertive discipline, including timeout. So if punishment is problematic for shaping behavior, why is timeout, office referrals, public shaming, detentions, suspensions commonly used in schools across the country? One reason is that it stops the behavior in the short term. It reinforces the teacher. Also, we're used to seeing it modeled in our classrooms, and many of our administrators expect us to use it. But there are situations in which operant conditioning is useful. For example, it can be helpful when behavior is especially disruptive or out of control. It can be used until the behavior is more manageable, and then we return to using induction. Overall, in regular classrooms, we want to use rewards and punishments sparingly. Instead, focus on induction. So how do you make decisions about how to best discipline students? Science supports 4 key principles. So the 4 principles are: first, get compliance. This is because compliance begets compliance. It creates a cooperative mindset and behavioral momentum in students. Also, if you don't get compliance in the here and now, it will be even harder to get compliance next time. Second principle is keep power minimal. Discipline encounters between children and adults are always inherently imbalanced in power. You always have more power than the child. But the 3 main types of discipline, psychological control, power assertion, and induction, differ dramatically in the degree to which power is emphasized. It is minimal in induction. The amount of power matters because students interpret their negative feelings during a discipline encounter as either stemming from themselves or stemming from your threat of discipline. In other words, the child's thinking, I feel bad because I disrupted the class, or I feel bad because the teacher threatened me with a punishment. You want them to interpret it as stemming from within so that they internalize your values. So when power is subtle, that is, it's not enough to seemingly force compliance, then students can attribute their compliance to their own volition, perhaps as a result of their own values. So you need enough power to get compliance, but not enough to cause them to interpret their compliance as the result of your threat. And you want to follow up with a statement about how good they are. Thank you for being cooperative. You're such a cooperative student. This helps them interpret their behavior as stemming from their own volition. The third principle is to keep the discipline encounter emotionally positive. It's normal for students to feel some anxiety during a discipline encounter, but it should take place within the context of a warm, supportive relationship and classroom. Students are more compliant when you smile at them and if they are asked pleasantly to comply with what you're asking. Students are also more compliant if they have a positive relationship with you. And students are more compliant with you if they feel you cooperate with them whenever possible. The fourth final principle is to allow negotiation. Students can respond in 3 ways to your discipline. They can defy you, I'm not going to do that. They can comply, yes sir, teacher, I'll do that right away. Or they can negotiate. How about if I do this in 5 more minutes so I can finish what I'm doing? We tend to think that unquestioning compliance is the ideal. How easy would life be if students complied all the time? But it's actually not necessarily ideal. Negotiating indicates social skill on the part of the student. It's adaptive for them. Negotiation is not the same as defiance. It is asserting one's own wants and needs in balance with your discipline request. And it's not a sign of weakness from you to allow negotiation. Healthy relationships require give and take. Despite knowing the principles of effective discipline and the cost of power assertion, teachers may use power assertion because they don't know of a better alternative. In addition, many of your students may have acclimated to power assertion in the home and don't seem to behave unless they are threatened with some kind of punishment. If your students come from homes where heavy power assertion is used, they may not even begin to listen to you until you threaten them with consequences. So how do you break that expectation? An alternative approach is referred to as persistent persuasion. This involves repeating induction until you get compliance. Another way to think about it is gentle nagging. You continually repeat the directive until the student complies. You avoid increasing the level of power or hostility. You use a reasonable, neutral, positive tone of voice. And you communicate confidence that the student will comply with what you're asking. You can change your rationale as you repeat the directive, but don't give up until you reach compliance. Once a child does comply, attribute the compliance to the student's good nature. You are such a cooperative student. As you first learn to use it, persistent persuasion will feel like it takes a lot of time. Yet escalating conflicts with power assertion also takes a lot of time and doesn't have the same payoffs. The beauty of this form of induction is that it will take less and less time to get compliance as the school year progresses, because your students are more likely to obey the second time with less effort, and your students are becoming more self-controlled. Taking your time to obtain compliance can be beneficial because it gives the student time to regain self-control, and it gives you more time to guide the student's appropriate behavior. You communicate clearly to the student and to the rest of the class who are eavesdropping what behavior is expected, and you invite power sharing so that students have time and reason to decide to adopt your agenda. In other words, it turns discipline into a teaching moment, not a punishment. Before closing our discussion of discipline, I want to point out that discipline is not always necessary. Before jumping into a discipline episode, ask, what's going on? Why did you do that? Sometimes this reveals a simple solution or a misunderstanding. Sometimes misbehavior occurs because a student lacks a skill, or they are unsure what is expected of them. When this is the case, it's better to teach the missing skill rather than to discipline the student. Another constructive approach to discipline for recurring misbehavior is called collaborative and proactive solutions. This involves 3 steps. Express empathy by saying, "Help me understand. Why did you do that?" Try to listen without criticism. Then express your concern and how you think others might be affected. Invite the student to come up with solutions that they could reasonably enact. Like persistent persuasion, this approach helps you maintain a positive relationship as well as come up with genuine solutions to recurring misbehavior. What is the relationship between induction and prosocial behavior? To give you an example from a study conducted by one of my doctoral students, preschool teachers learned how to use inductive discipline. The results showed that preschoolers doubled their prosocial behavior in just 7 weeks after their teachers learned to use inductive discipline strategies. In summary, use induction rather than rewards and punishments. In some situations where you use rewards and punishments, please be mindful of how you do so. Consider whether discipline is even necessary in every situation. To reiterate, induction leads to greater prosocial behavior among students. Induction is more likely to lead to a student to internalize your values. Induction promotes self-control, which makes students more likely to obey rules even when authority figures are not around. Induction gives students information that they need to guide behavior in future situations. Induction communicates caring for students because you are conveying the message that you respect them and are willing to reason with them. Induction allows you to communicate that you assume students' best intentions, which can be powerful in shaping students' moral identity. Induction is powerful in promoting prosocial behavior because it helps students come to value others' well-being, which is what prosocial behavior is all about. Please refer to Chapter 4 in your book for further information. I look forward to discussing this topic further throughout this professional development. Thank you for your time.